You see, Skinner didn't really have any account of non-operant behavior. In 1938, Skinner came out with the behavior of organisms. He really showed, yes, a true natural science of behavior is possible. Unfortunately, then in 1945, he went off the rails. He started talking about private events, and that has created endless confusion. So at that level, there's been quite a lot of resistance. I've had to back up my ideas with a lot of experimental evidence. I think one of the reasons why clinicians are more open to my ideas, I think because the old SDR model really doesn't fit very well with what the clinicians are trying to do.
Some people argue that your theory is essentially Skinner's, just with better marketing. What would you say to them?
I was born in New York City and grew up there. But, relevant to behavior analysis, when I was a young kid, I was always interested in animals, and I kept a lot of different animals. Even in New York City, you could do that actually. So various things, fish, birds, white mice, and so on. And I went to high school that was that emphasized science, the Bronx High School of Science. And then when I arrived at Harvard as a freshman, I just thought, well, I'm going to study animal behavior, and so that ought to be in the biology department. And so I was going to concentrate in biology. But in the spring of my freshman year, in those days, of course, there wasn't all of the internet and digital stuff and so on. You got a paper catalog, a book, and flipped through it. So I saw in there, flipping through the catalog, a course on human behavior. I think it was Science and Human Behavior. It was Nat Sci 114. And I thought, well, okay, that'll be interesting. Let's go and see what that is. I sat in on the first couple of classes, and Skinner was teaching that course, and I liked it pretty well. It was interesting. So when the next semester came, that the first semester of my sophomore year, I looked in the catalog at psychology courses, and I discovered, there are these courses that deal with behavior. I took one. And that one was taught by Richard Herrnstein, The Psychology of Learning, it was called, and it was, also interesting, and all about behavior. And I went to see Herrnstein in his office, and talked to him for one reason or another, and he convinced me to switch my concentration from biology to psychology. So that's how I got into behavior analysis. And I did a senior honors thesis, choice in rats, and then after I spent a year in England at the sub-department of animal behavior at Cambridge, and And that was interesting too, because they took a quite a different approach to behavior, ethology really. And I went back to Harvard as a postdoc, and then I was on the faculty. And so that's kind of summary of my career, you might say. Uh, and I taught for many years at the University of New Hampshire. I moved to California. Moving to California actually was a sort of pivotal event, because there I fell in with a lot of evolutionary biologists, and they very much influenced my thinking. So I'll talk about what's your next question?
Oh, we just wanted to ask you, how was your experience working in a laboratory?
Yeah, okay. Well, so I of course I was exposed to Skinner early on, and then but then I was really influenced by Herrnstein, and uh, so it was a really wonderful time. I mean, it was a big laboratory, and Herrnstein was very free. He let, if you thought of an experiment to do, and the equipment and animals were there to do it, you just got to do it. So as a graduate student, I had about 5 different experiments going on. So it was a really great time, and every week we would meet, everyone doing research in the laboratory with Herrnstein, and those were very stimulating. We call them the pigeon meetings, and so it was, and that was where I got a lot of my early ideas about how to think about behavior in a more, in what I would call now the molar view. So what I would say is that, well, first of all, before I say anything critical about Skinner, I want to say that his contributions were enormous. I mean, he really founded the field of behavior analysis, and he invented some really fundamental concepts that really made the science possible. For example, he invented the idea of operant behavior. That was really fundamental, because it allowed us to get away from the reflex as a model of behavior. See, Watson, for example, was very limited, because he always thought in those terms, S and R. And so Skinner's invention of operant behavior, it can't be, the importance of it can't be overstated. And the idea that rate could be a dependent variable, that also was a totally novel idea, and it really made it possible to study behavior in a quantitative way. And then the concept of stimulus control, you see, he got away from the SR idea by positing that a stimulus actually has the effect of modulating response rate. And then there's one of his great discoveries was the idea of verbal behavior. That the idea that what I'm doing right now, talking, this is actually operant behavior, right? And so those are huge contributions and should not be underestimated. But they pointed in a direction that Skinner wasn't willing or able to go in, because he was stuck with the idea of the response. You see, a discrete response, which he got that from reflexology, and the contiguity of events. That the reinforcer immediately follows a response and strengthens it. Really what Thorndike had come up with, and he hadn't advanced beyond that. So Skinner was hampered actually by his early exposure to thinking about reflexes. He did his doctoral work in the biology department studying reflexes, and he didn't see that the idea of rate as a dependent variable actually points to the idea of extended patterns of behavior, what I would nowadays call activities, and because he focused on momentary relations and momentary events. And the other weakness was he didn't actually propose any kind of a mechanism for stimulus control. He described it, and that was very helpful. But so and his application of his concepts to verbal behavior was quite, I think, misleading. It's verbal behavior is not composed of discrete responses, and he at some level he must have seen that himself, but he couldn't go or wouldn't go in the direction that his ideas pointed. And Herrnstein made steps in that direction. And so I was very much influenced by Herrnstein, but even he didn't go to the logical conclusion. He sort of thought about it, but never actually systematized it. It was a seminal moment for me when at one of those pigeon meetings, Dick got up on at the blackboard, and he drew on the blackboard the feedback function for an interval schedule. Right, it's a curve, and it approaches, goes from the origin. It's curves, and it approaches an asymptote, and so it's a relation that shows the dependence of the rate of obtaining, let's say, food, versus the rate of the activity. And you can see, there's a totally different way of thinking from the old discrete responses and immediate reinforcement and so on. So that was a big influence on me. And even as actually was looking back at a journal that I started to keep when I was a graduate student, and I see that I was thinking of these things, behavior extended in time, a flow, and not little punctate, discrete responses. So yeah, I tried to systematize this,
Hmm.
and in 1973, a paper came out called the correlation-based law of effect, and that was where I first, laid out what I thought was the beginnings, anyway, of a whole way of looking at behavior, and then followed it up with experiments and other papers, and I saw, though, that there's a larger context set by evolutionary theory, and that this needed to be integrated with evolutionary theory. Well, that was something that Skinner had never done. He wrote that 1981 paper saying, the selection by consequences, but that just was pointing to a possible parallel. What I was interested in is, what's the evolutionary context for behavior? Why is there even behavior at all? And so I began to think about what could you say about behavior that would make it understandable in the light of evolution. Well, now I have to backtrack a little bit. In 1972, Eve Siegel came out with it's a chapter in a book, actually, with the concept of induction. And it was originally just intended, to talk about adjunctive behavior, or anyway, non-operant behavior. You see, Skinner didn't really have any account of non-operant behavior. He just sort of, I guess, took that for granted. I'm not sure, but she came up with this concept of induction, and it took me many years before I actually appreciated the full implications of that induction idea. So now what I think is, okay, so we can see that certain features of the environment affect behavior in powerful ways as a result of natural selection. You see, this is the way now I see that we can integrate with evolutionary theory. As a result of natural selection, events like a potential mate, or a predator, or food, or nesting site, and so on, these are features of the environment that have powerful effects on behavior. Why? Because any creature in a population that didn't respond well to those kinds of events didn't leave very many offspring. So you can see that selection would make sure that organisms are constructed in such a way that those events, those features of the environment, will have big effects. Now, when we say effects, That's where induction comes in. They induce activities. And so predators induce anti-predation. And a potential mate induces courtship. Food induces ingestion, pursuit, capture, so on. And so what you see is that when you bring an organism like a pigeon into the laboratory and you start giving it food from time to time, you've deprived it of food and you give it some food, you get a lot of activity. Well, what's a pigeon do in its natural environment? It pecks at things. And so you're really kind of exploiting that tendency to peck, and the food induces pecking. But here's the thing. What Eve Seagull's insight showed is it's not a matter of contiguity exactly. It's that the food is inducing all sorts of activities, whole pattern of activities, and it's not necessarily contiguous with them. So it's not like that old concept of reinforcement. But what I've come to see now is that what we used to call positive reinforcement is really just an example of induction. The way I was taught, I would expect probably you were taught, is that when some behavior is reinforced, the reinforcer in following the behavior increases the probability or the rate of that behavior. Okay, I'm purposely not talking about responses, but that was the way it was couched. Well, if you think about induction, the operant behavior that produces the so-called reinforcer is then induced by that reinforcer. So what we call positive reinforcement is really just part of or an example of induction. Well, this, I think, is important because the concept of induction explains so much. It covers not only adjunctive or non-operant behavior, but it covers operant behavior too. And moreover, you can think of it in relation to avoidance. Think of a predator inducing anti-predation activities like fleeing or freezing and so on. That's avoidance. And actually, I went back to I got Sidman's original data from 1963 about his experiments with the free operant avoidance, and I found that you could explain them all his data with the concept of induction, and the quantitative actually, because what I've found in my experiments is that induction follows a power law. That is, the rate of food, for example, or the rate of electric shock, for that matter, raised to a power, and so it seems to me that this concept of induction is a very good one, a powerful one. So I was exposed after I moved to California, and I was exposed to all these evolutionary biologists. A couple of things came out of that, and one of them was that I got introduced to process ontology. Right, these philosophers of biology were talking a lot about process. And there's a wonderful book that actually called Everything Flows, edited by Dupre and Nicholson. So I saw that book, and that convinced me that what I'd been talking about, activities, really are just examples of processes. So you can think of, all the way back in 2013, for example, a paper that I came out with was what counts as behavior, and I was talking about activities extended in time, not discrete responses. But I saw that an activity has parts that are themselves activities. Well, now what I realize is that that's what's true of a process. Every process has parts that are also processes. So say if you think of a process like a running automobile, it that's one process, but its parts are things like the spinning of the wheels, the running of the engine, and so on. And the same is true of behavior. Well, back when I was a graduate student, I thought, someday I want to write a textbook of behavior analysis and not have to have an introductory history chapter, right? I looked at, I thought, my physics textbook, my chemistry textbook, they don't start with a big chapter on history. It was only when you talk about behavior that somehow or other you always had to talk about the history. And I thought, no, if we had a really good conceptual framework, we wouldn't need to have a historical introductory chapter. And so I finally wrote that book. It came out in last year. Introduction to Behavior, it's called, an evolutionary perspective. So I think there is a whole conceptual framework that makes our field much more coherent if we use these concepts of process and multi-scale molar, the multi-scale molar view, I call it now. Yeah.
Okay. So, how would you say your theoretical model has been received by the academic community?
Yes. Well, of course, there most people, most of behavior analysts were taught this other view, which I was taught too. I mean, when the the three-term contingency, SR or SD, I guess you say, and R and then SR. Well, they particularly, my peers, they don't easily change their views. So there's been at that level, there's been quite a lot of resistance. I've had to back up my ideas with a lot of experimental evidence, uh, but I find that they're younger behavior analysts are more open-minded, and they're more willing to listen. Uh, so some of my peers, they say things like, I've actually gotten reviews of articles like this. Well, I can see there's something here, but I don't want to change. That's what it comes down to. Or, I've been thinking this other way all my life, and I don't want to change. So younger behavior analysts who haven't been thinking that way all their life like that are more open-minded. And there's another group who are also more open-minded that I hadn't anticipated, and that's the clinicians, the people who actually are thinking about practical problems and delivery of services and so on. Actually, they're open to new ideas, much more so. And so I've sometimes given talks to clinicians, and they've been well received. So it's varied. I think maybe there will come a time. So there's that. I haven't even said anything about the philosophy involved, behaviorism, and that there again, things I've said have not always been received well. You see, in 1945, in 1938, Skinner came out with the behavior of organisms, and that was a watershed event because he was showing the way to a real science of behavior, natural science of behavior, where when you don't talk about what's going on inside the organism and so on, you're talking about the relation between behavior and environmental events. And even if you're going to talk about the state of the organism, that still is the result of environmental events. So he really showed, yes, a true science of natural science of behavior is possible. Well, that's also the central proposition in behaviorism, the philosophy. Unfortunately, then in 1945, he went off the rails. He started talking about private events, and that has created endless confusion. The idea that somehow or other thoughts and feelings are causal. Of course, the people who talk about private events will always say, they're not causal. But if they're not causal, then why are you bothering? If you could make them public, they'd be data. But there's so much confusion as a result. Well, if you think about, what it would take for a natural science of behavior Well, first of all, it would mean that behavioral events are like other natural events. You know, think about um, geology, which looks at the changes that occur in the earth and the stones and so on, or astronomy that looks at the evolution of stars and so on. Uh, Nobody's talking about private events. The stone doesn't have private events. The stars don't have private events, and neither do you have to talk about private events in talking about the behavior of organisms other than human beings. So um, it, it it doesn't help to talk about private events. It's only distracting and confusing. If you, what I've argued is that if you look at behavior as a flow and activities extended in time, then the need to talk about private events, which because they're private, you can't observe, is falls away. Of course, um, it's possible that subvocal speech, be uh, I don't know about you, but I talk to myself uh, without anyone else being able to hear it. That's subvocal speech. It can be perhaps made public. I read that recently someone actually succeeded in doing that with a person who couldn't speak. And so, fine. If those events are public, then they become data. But uh, how much do we learn from that? I don't know. We'd have to see, but I doubt very much. And so, uh, so I argue that behaviorism, first of all, takes this proposition seriously that a natural science of behavior is possible. That means behavioral events are natural events, and that means that they are explained in relation to other natural events. And that's it. We don't need to talk about the things that we cannot observe. Uh, Although, of course, we could talk about physiology because that potentially is observable. We could study what goes on in the brain when an organism is behaving, and people do. They try to figure out how the brain participates in behavior. But mind you, there are a lot of them fall into the trap of thinking that what goes on in the brain is behavior. That's a big mistake. The brain, like the rest of the body, participates in behavior, but um, the brain can't behave, doesn't have the means to behave. You hear these neuroscientists, or you see these neuroscientists saying things like the brain decides, or the brain uh, makes this thing uh, you know happen, and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, that's a mistake. It's a certain from a philosophical point of view, it is what Gilbert Ryle called a category error. You take the label of a category as if it were an instance of the category, and And of course, that creates a lot of confusion. So, and he gives examples like intelligence, for example. What it, what is intelligence? Well, intelligence is a lot of things. Being able to do calculus, being able to solve problems of various sorts, and to construct conceptual schemes and all that, that's intelligence. But to say that those things are the result of intelligence, that's a category error, see, because those things are intelligence. Uh, so so my ideas about behaviorism are based on this idea that yes, we can have a natural science of behavior, and that means that behavioral events really are natural events and understood in the light of other natural events. So I wrote a book called Understanding Behaviorism, and sketched out. I thought of it as a kind of an update of Skinner's book Science and Human Behavior. So I tried to sketch out how you'd approach all different ideas and social problems. So you take the most basic philosophical problems like what is knowledge, what is purpose, and what is thought. So these when you approach them from a behavioral point of view, they become understandable. And then, of course, there's all sorts of social issues which also become understandable, and culture, or what culture consists of is behavior. Well, so I've tried to make these concepts more concrete, and have I succeeded to some extent? Yeah, I think.
Okay, so some people argue that your theory is essentially Skinner's, just with better marketing. What would you say to them?
What, we should have better marketing of behavior analysis? Yeah, well, I think that there's a huge problem because the average person in the street, let's say an English speaker or a Spanish speaker, I suspect the same, actually has a whole theory about behavior because it's built into the language. So for the layperson, its thoughts and feelings are the really important thing, and it's your thoughts and feelings that lead to your behavior, and those are based on whatever results you want. So that's the theory that I call folk psychology. Folk psychology is a big impediment to behavior analysis. And you can have folk physics, folk biology, but the physicists and the biologists have had plenty of time to overcome the prejudices of in everyday thought, and biology, of course, most recently, the getting rid of the concepts like uh, what was called vis viva, or vital energy, these kinds of things which actually explain nothing. Biology now is very much a natural science, and the explanations of why creatures are the way they are natural. So I think that the challenge for behavior analysis is folk psychology. That's where people will object. They won't like the idea of being told that their behavior is determined by environmental events. They want to think, I have free will and I make my choices and so on, autonomy. And so there's a lot of resistance to the idea of a science of behavior. And so how would behavior analysts improve their marketing? Well, it's tricky. I did write a paper, it came out in 1995, about the concept of agency. And I pointed out that there in those days there were a lot of new age thinkers around, writing books and selling products and things, and those people were really determinists, although they never actually talked about that. Instead, they were saying, how we live in the world, and what's our best behavior and so on. Well, I thought then we could take a page out of the New Age book and talk about behavior analysis as the approach to behavior that makes us one with the world. And if you think about, the natural science of behavior, well, okay, that puts us in the natural world along with everything else. And I would now suggest that all of the world is one great process, and every living creature, every non-living creature, for that matter, but every living creature is a part of that great process. That's the world, and you're part of that process. And you're a process yourself. It's all process all the way down. So we could, conceivably present behavior analysis as a unifying idea, instead of telling people that they're wrong, which nobody wants to hear.
What place do ethics and responsibility have in their deterministic approach to behavior like yours?
I talk about this. That's one of the important areas. I talk about this in that book, Understanding Behaviorism, because then you have to address questions like, what is freedom, and and what about responsibility? the gist of it is that there's no reason not to hold people responsible. That's a bit different from saying that someone is responsible. So people who engage in antisocial behavior, well, that behavior needs to be dealt with. All right. So the possibility is to actually impose consequences if the consequences will have an effect. If the person has committed a crime, let's say, you have a teenager who's stolen a car, what's the right way to deal with that? I would suggest that being punitive about it and saying he needs to be punished is the wrong way to go about that. But yes, he should be held responsible. But what that means maybe is counseling, therapy. Maybe this is of course very idealistic, but maybe our jails could be true correction facilities. So they're often called correction, or a place where someone might actually benefit and come out of it a behaving more socially well. This of course is an ideal. It's not the way it generally happens, but I'm certainly not the first person to suggest that such an approach would be far better than saying well, retribution, the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth kind of idea. And so if a person, if a person murders another person, sometimes, people think we want justice. Well, what is justice? Well, so, the murderer should be put to death. Well, maybe, but, it also might be that you can consider all the extenuating circumstances involved. Maybe this is a young man who's been involved with selling and taking drugs, and maybe the primary problem is not so much that he murdered someone as what leads up to that. And so maybe if we give him a different way of living, like having a job and so on, maybe he becomes a productive member of society. So why does he have to be executed,
Hmm.
Yeah, you mentioned prisons. How can we actually help people to change?
Well, we have some practical techniques, of course. Actually, this is, I think, one of the reasons why clinicians are more open to my ideas. I think because the old the SDRSR model really doesn't fit very well with what the clinicians are trying to do. They want to try to modify people's behavior. Well, of course, you can do that in a classroom or a very controlled setting, but there's also the possibility of what you might call social engineering, and in fact, a lot of that goes on. People don't necessarily call it social engineering, and they don't necessarily call it behavior modification. But
Mhm.
you get a lot of education about the use of alcohol, for example. And an organization like Alcoholics Anonymous is there to change behavior. That's what they're trying to do. It may be couched in all sorts of mentalistic terms, but if you analyze what they actually do, that's designed to induce other behavior than drinking. So I would say that and I think some clinicians are open to this. Here's a really much more powerful way of thinking about behavior and changing it. You have much more flexibility than some kind of rigid, now we got to give the reinforcer approach.
In your point of view, how much of our daily behavior and even what we call personality is shaped by genetics and how much by learning?
Well, that's a trick question. So that's well, first of all, what's meant by personality, understand, in the psychologist's vocabulary and maybe lay people, personality is something inside and it makes you behave. But personality from a behavioral point of view is just regular patterns of behavior that turn up. So the person behaves in certain ways in certain situations, and that is predictable. So if you notice those patterns, you may say, oh, that's his personality. Well, the patterns are the personality. That's the thing that Gilbert Ryle would say. Don't make the category mistake of then saying he behaves that way because it's his personality. It is his personality, the patterns of his behavior or her behavior, and so I would say what was the question again? Yeah.
How many weight has talking about our personality, how much weight is in genetics and how much weight is in learning?
Yeah, well, that's a false dichotomy. So it's very important, actually, to get away from that way of thinking. Behavior is the result of development, just the way let's say your hands are the result of development. That from the time that you have a fertilized egg until the baby is born, all these changes, many of them just are understood as chemical and physical changes that lead to the development of a baby. But then the baby grows. That also is lawful. So the behavior is also the outcome of development, but it's very much conditioned by environmental factors. We now know that the environmental factors can actually cause genes to be turned off or turned on. And when that happens, even the shape of a body can change. As an example, a simple example, you have a type of fish that lives in ponds, and if the pond also contains a predator fish, then those small fish change their body shape so that they're harder to consume, and faster swimmers. So the chemicals from the predator actually change the shape of the body of the fish. Then there are many, many examples of this that have been studied. Well, if that's true of fish, it's also true of human beings, and it should be no surprise that this environmental circumstances in which a child grows will have big effects on behavior. But it's not a dichotomy like that of genetics versus learning. It's much more complicated than that. What people say is, well, the genes interact with the environment. But what does that mean? Well, it means the environment actually does have effects on the genes, and the genes actually have effects on the environment, or the way the environment affects the organism. So I think the best answer I can give you is that that the development of an organism depends on the environment and the genes in concert.
So, how do you imagine the future of behaviorism?
I don't. I don't know what. I mean, I've done my best to try to lay out, on the one hand, the philosophy that I think makes sense, and as a underpinning to a science of behavior, because the science of behavior is bound to be controversial in a way that, let's say, physics or chemistry is not. So that's I think that this idea that science can be that there can be a science of behavior and a natural science of behavior, that has huge implications. I tried to develop some of those implications. Maybe others will. But that's philosophy. I remember my friend Howie Racklin used to write papers for philosophy journals. They were always rejected. That the philosophers couldn't stand these behavioral approaches, the behaviorist approaches to behavior. So finally, he actually did get a paper accepted by a philosophy journal, and he was so proud. He told me, yeah. Anyway, Howie and I and Phil Heinlein, we've tried to develop behaviorism in that line. But behavior analysis, that's another matter. The science itself, right? I think there's a good future for it. So far, of course, it's when it's accepted because of its practical implications. The treatment of autism, techniques with the developmentally disabled, and so on. I don't know a lot about that. I'm a basic researcher, but my impression is that for behavior analysis to be accepted, it has to be proven to be practical. And I think that's what's happening.
What would you like the next generation of behavioral psychologists to remember about your work?
What would I like them to remember?
Yeah, about your work.
What, can't I say all of it? Well, I feel like I've done quite a lot of empirical work that's maybe worth remembering, and I do believe that these concepts I have developed of process and induction and thinking about behavior, in a natural science way, I think these are useful concepts for thinking about behavior in general, and even for practical purposes too. So I would hope that people would read my books and learn to think about behavior with this multi-scale molar view, because it seems to me to be a really powerful conceptual framework for understanding the whole field.
Well, William, we'll be concluding here our interview. Thank you. It was an honor to have you here to let us interview you, and well, we're gonna finish this interview with anything you would like to say to share with our audience.
I think that that behaviorism has something to contribute of a broad nature. How we view ourselves in relation to the universe. I think because we're the science that addresses, I think, the nature of consciousness. And so I've been thinking quite a bit lately about the way that we approach understanding ourselves in relationship to the universe. And I believe that there is a one reality. As I said, you could think of it as a one great process, and everything and everyone is a part of that one great process. And I'm not the first person to think this way by any means. You will find it in the actually in the West. You'll find it, for example, George Berkeley in the early 18th century, talking about all the world is perception. If you go back thousands of years, the rishis in India, they talked about the world as an illusion. And Meher Baba, great spiritual master of the 20th century, he talked about it as imagination. And you find it over and over again in all sorts of traditions, the idea that the reality is one, and the manyness that we see is actually an illusion or imagination, is to be overcome, to become who you really are, is to overcome that separateness. And I think that behavior analysis can actually be completely compatible with that way of thinking.
With this, we finish. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you a lot. It was
Okay, good. All right, very good.
Have a nice day.
Yeah, have a good night.
Thank you.
Gracias por ver este vídeo, os dejamos por aquí un enlace a nuestra última formación y por aquí algunos vídeos que os pueden resultar de interés. Si estáis buscando ayuda psicológica, también podéis mirar en la descripción del vídeo, donde encontraréis nuestra web y podréis solicitar asistencia terapéutica de un profesional confiable y que os ofrecerá ayuda psicológica basada en evidencia científica.